So, welcome everyone to today's webinar on the 2025 edition of the Global Hydrogen Review. My name is Timo Gühl. I'm Chief Energy Technology Officer here at the International Energy Agency, and I'm delighted to have all of you with us today. I'm joined around me by part of the team of lead authors of this report, who will be presenting in just a couple of minutes to you the key findings of this year's edition of the Global Hydrogen Review. But before we get started with those key findings, let me give you a couple of words of context here on how to see this year's edition. First and foremost, important to acknowledge that the Global Hydrogen Review is an outcome of the Clean Energy Ministerial Hydrogen Initiative that is supported by more than 20 governments around the world. I would like to take the opportunity to thank government representatives, of which I'm sure many of whom are available online today, government representatives of the initiative for their valuable feedback and policy updates, as well as all the reviewers and institutions that contributed directly or indirectly to the analysis in this report. The report is a product of the IEA, but it would not be the same product without all the helping hands that we're getting from all around the world. This year's edition actually marks a special milestone. It is the 5th edition of this report. Since it was launched in 2021, our goal has been to track developments in hydrogen production and demand, as well as infrastructure, trade, policy, investments, and innovation. The idea of this report is to provide an annual snapshot of the status of the sector and what the current status and all the policies that are being implemented around the world, the projects that are under development, might mean for the future, as a means to help government and industry participants to fine-tune their own hydrogen strategies. Now, having observed the hydrogen space over many years, and over these couple of years in particular, really since we released as the IEA our flagship report, The Future of Hydrogen, in 2019 at the request of Japan's G20 presidency, the global conversation on hydrogen has evolved very significantly. At the time, hydrogen was a niche discussion along the lines of hydrogen is the fuel of the future and will forever be just that. Over the years, it became a discussion where hydrogen was considered a key strategic opportunity in global energy systems, a key means to support progress towards all sorts of energy-related policy goals, climate, energy security, industrial competitiveness, and so on. But as it goes with a new sector, a new and emerging clean energy sector, after a wave of ambitious commitments and announcements from governments and the private sector, the sector is now facing headwinds. Headlines are no longer dominated by the opportunity that hydrogen can offer, but by project delays, cancellations, bankruptcies, and reduced policy commitments. In many ways, this led to a cooling of the sentiment and raised questions about whether the earlier enthusiasm that we had seen a couple of years ago was just a hype, and what really is hydrogen's potential in the future energy system. This is where I think this particular report is so important. At the IEA, we are a data-driven organization. The data that my colleagues will show you in a couple of minutes tells a much more nuanced story. It's not the enthusiasm that we've seen a couple of years ago, but it's neither the very negative sentiment that we're seeing in media today. Over the past 5 years, the sector has made actually quite significant progress. Projects for the production of low-emission hydrogen have grown from a handful of demonstrations in 2021 to more than 200 final investment decisions by the end of 2024. So a huge growth, in fact. Global investment in low-emission hydrogen production reached $4.3 billion in 2024, an 80% jump year on year. The production of low-emission hydrogen is now on track to exceed 1 million tons by the end of 2025. And when you look at things ahead, as we do at the IEA, and here not through the lens of our scenarios, but on the basis of projects that are already in operation today and are otherwise under construction or have reached a final investment decision, then the production of low-emission hydrogen is expected realistically to reach more than 4 million tons by the year 2030. An important and success story in clean energy, very much comparable to some of the strongest growth stories we have seen in clean tech over the years. So a lot of great progress, but of course, still this progress is well below the expectations that some had earlier this decade in governments and the private sector. Of course, you can argue whether these expectations were justified at the time, but hydrogen continues to face significant barriers. High production costs, lack of demand, regulatory uncertainties, infrastructure gaps. These are all important impediments for further progress even today. Like other clean energy technologies, hydrogen may also face new challenges that come from government budgets shifting towards other urgent priorities at this particular moment in time. But this is again why such a data-driven assessment is so important. Taking stock of the progress today, understand the challenges ahead, not getting carried away by high expectations that stakeholders have from the opportunity, nor getting discouraged by near-term setbacks. This is what data-driven analysis is all about. And this is exactly what this 5th edition of the Global Hydrogen Review has done. Once again, it provides a comprehensive, first of its kind assessment of what level of hydrogen adoption could be realistically achieved by the end of this decade. My colleagues will explain you how we got to this type of assessment in a couple of minutes of time, and offers recommendations on the priority areas for further action. Just to say, before I hand the word to my colleagues, the report is not only a report, it is complemented by a variety of other tracking tools, such as our production and infrastructure project databases, and a new hydrogen tracker, which will be introduced at the end of the session, all freely available on our website. Before we begin, I would like to thank the team led by my colleagues Uwe Remme and José Bermudez that has been working so hard once again to bring together this edition of the Global Hydrogen Review, which over the past 5 years has become the go-to source for all things hydrogen. With that, I hand it over to my colleague José Bermudez, who will guide us through today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Timur, and welcome everybody to this webinar. So before starting with the presentation, a few practical notes. After we present the report, there will be a Q&A session, so please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit your questions so we can address them at the end. And also, please be aware that the webinar will be recorded, and both the recording and the presentation slides will be made available on our website after the event. So let's move to the presentation and concretely the topics that we are going to discuss today. We're going to start with an introduction to provide a snapshot of the status of the hydrogen sector today. Then we will jump into the evolution of the announced projects for the production of low emissions hydrogen and the cost of production. Then we will move into the topic of demand and the efforts done to stimulate it. We'll continue with trade and a new analysis on the role that ports can play to enable adoption of hydrogen-based fuels. We will discuss opportunities and challenges for emerging economies to turn hydrogen ambitions into deployment, and we'll provide a short overview of policy developments over the last year, to then finish with the main findings of the special focus chapter of the report, which this year has been dedicated to Southeast Asia. So starting with the content, as I mentioned, let's start with a recap of the status of the hydrogen sector today. At the time that we released the Global Hydrogen Review in 2021, the hydrogen sector have gained a lot of momentum. There was a wave of ambitious government commitments that received a vigorous response from the private sector, with hundreds of announcements of projects for the production of low emissions hydrogen. Now, 4 years later, negative news from the sector are making headlines, including project delays, cancellations, downward revisions of commitments for low emissions hydrogen production and use. So while the challenges facing the hydrogen sector have led to a slower deployment than what was expected in 2021, when we take a closer look to the data, we see that rather than stalling or faltering, the sector is progressing and reaching important milestones. And let me give you some examples. Back in 2021, only a handful of small projects for the production of low emissions hydrogen were in operation. Production has increased by 60% since then, and we are on track this year to reach 1 million tons for the first time. And then looking at 2030, and based only on projects that are in operation, under construction, or that reach a final investment decision, low emissions hydrogen production is set to surpass 4 million tons by 2030. This is much lower than the ambitious set at the beginning of the decade, but it still represents a growth from less than 1% of total hydrogen production today to around 4% in 2030. This would put low emissions hydrogen growth on par with the fast expansions of other clean energy technologies that we have seen in recent years, such as solar photovoltaics. Also, projects under development are becoming larger. In 2021, the largest electrolyzer in operation had a capacity of 30 megawatts. Earlier this year, a 500 megawatts electrolyzer was commissioned in China, and the world's largest electrolysis project under construction, the NEOM Green Hydrogen project in Saudi Arabia, has an expected capacity of more than 2 gigawatts to be in operation in 2027. Technology development is also progressing, and many technologies are moving from small prototypes to demonstration to commercialization. And this is particularly important on the demand side, as shown here with some examples for steel and shipping, in areas where we see several technologies can reach commercialization before 2030, which will help unlocking significant demands for low emissions hydrogen. However, and despite this progress, the hydrogen sector is entering a phase of consolidation. In the last few years, we have seen a continuous growth in the potential low emissions hydrogen production that announced projects could reach by 2030. By this year, our estimate has declined for the first time due to projects being cancelled and particularly postponed after 2030. The potential production fell in particularly for electrolysis projects, which were responsible for 80% of this decline. Looking at the status of the projects, the drop is mainly coming from projects that are at early stages of development, when assumptions on cost reduction have been too ambitious and expectations for future market developments too optimistic. The reasons that companies are using to reduce, delay, or suspend projects can be manifold, but there are 4 of them that stand out. First, regulatory challenges, such as unclear or complex definitions of what low emissions hydrogen is, or slow permitting processes. Second, the high cost of low emissions hydrogen, which in combination with uncertainty about criteria to secure public funding, impacts the economics of the projects and delay investments. Third, technical and supply chain challenges. We have seen some electrolyzer manufacturers that are facing insolvency or scaling back operations, which can undermine the confidence in the supply chain and increase risks during project delivery and operation. And finally, many projects are struggling to secure credit-worthy offtake agreement, which is a topic that we will discuss in more detail later in the presentation. As already mentioned, low emissions hydrogen production from projects that are in operation, under construction, or that reach FID could surpass 4 million tons by 2030, which represents around 10% of the total project pipeline. The remainder 90% is at early stages of development. So with the decline observed in the project pipeline this year, and only 5 years left to 2030, we have asked ourselves how many of these projects can realistically be in operation by 2030. To answer this question, we have assessed the likelihood of projects being in operation by 2030, taking into account factors like the status, the size, the targeted hydrogen use, and the location of the project, considering aspects like financing cost or existing energy infrastructure in a given country. Based on this assessment, we think that an additional 6 million tons of low emissions hydrogen production has a strong potential to be in operation by 2030, but its realization will depend on government support to close the cost gap that we will discuss later, and also policies to stimulate demand in existing industrial applications. On the other side of the spectrum, around half of the potential production in the pipeline has low potential, or is uncertain to be in operation by 2030. Around half of these projects are very large electrolysis projects in emerging and developing economies with low-cost renewable resources, but lack of financing, problems to secure offtake agreements, and limited infrastructure. I have just mentioned the problem or the topic of cost, which remains as the main barrier for the adoption of low emissions hydrogen. In the last couple of years, the cost of renewable hydrogen has been going up rather than down due to inflation, but also cost estimates becoming more realistic as projects progress to more advanced stages. Today, there is a cost gap between renewable hydrogen and the fossil-based routes, but this gap differs by region. In China, this gap is relatively small thanks to low electricity prices, low cost of capital, but also economies of scale and experience with large projects. This enables low cost of the balance of plant of the electrolyzer, but also low cost for engineering, procurement, and construction. These altogether represent 80 to 85% of the total capex of a project. So in China, today, the cheapest renewable hydrogen is already at the same cost level as the most expensive hydrogen produced from fossil fuels with carbon capture. And by 2030, we estimate that renewable hydrogen will become cheaper, and this overlap is expected to increase. And so the cheapest renewable hydrogen could even become competitive with unabated fossil-based production. For regions with cheap gas, like the United States or certain countries in the Middle East, it is much more difficult for renewable hydrogen to compete. Even though these regions have large renewable resources, the high capital intensity of renewable hydrogen makes it much more difficult or much more expensive and more difficult to compete. Although the cost gap is expected to decrease significantly, it's said to remain large, and CCUS is likely to be more competitive for producing low emissions hydrogen in the near term. Finally, for regions that have a relatively high cost of natural gas and import dependency, like Europe or certain countries in Latin America, and that do not count with the technology and capital cost advantage of China, the cost gap is still significant today, but it is expected to reduce thanks to technology improvement and policies like carbon pricing. In the best locations for renewable hydrogen production in these regions, the cost gap could be reduced to around $0.50 per kilogram by 2030. And now I hand over to my colleague Carolina, which will speak about electrolyzers and demand.
Thank you, Jose. China is driving the deployment and manufacturing of electrolyzers today. The country accounts for 2/3 of the global installed electrolyzer capacity, 2/3 of the capacity that has reached FID, and nearly 60% of the global electrolyzer manufacturing capacity. This situation mirrors its remarkable success in solar PV and electric vehicles, so people have started to ask the question, will electrolyzers follow the same trends as solar PV and electric vehicles with China dominating the global market? Comparing the cost of making and installing an electrolyzer in Europe with China, the immediate answer may be yes. The cost of installing a Chinese electrolyzer in China are indeed 60% lower than installing a European one in Europe. However, the equipment costs are only part of the total investment to install an electrolyzer. More than half of the total costs are for engineering, procurement, and construction, which depend on local conditions. When considering also tariffs and shipping costs, the cost advantage of installing a Chinese electrolyzer in Europe shrinks to 20% compared to European manufacturers. The impact on hydrogen production costs is even smaller. With electricity costs being a major component in the production cost of hydrogen, and Chinese electrolyzers today are still suffering from lower efficiencies and performance, the cost advantage narrows further. And even with certain projects configurations, the production costs could be higher if using Chinese electrolyzers. But this doesn't mean that this situation will not change in the future, and Chinese manufacturers are already investing to address performance issues and are exploring overseas manufacturing. Continuing with the topic of demand, a good indicator of momentum in the sector is the signing of offtake agreements. The volume of new signed deals fell sharply in 2024 to around 1.7 million tons compared with 2.4 million tons in 2023. This decline mainly reflects fewer trade-oriented agreements, particularly those targeting international exports without a specific end use, which are usually preliminary and non-binding. Looking at the distribution of these offtake agreements, offtake activity remains concentrated in refining, industry, and hydrogen-based fuels, which together account for around 85% of total volumes. Another point is that agreements in 2024 were weaker overall. Only around 20% were firm contracts, compared with about 30% in 2023. However, on a positive note, some preliminary deals from previous years were converted into firm contracts, helping to unlock investment decisions in production projects. Investment in projects to produce low emissions hydrogen have been growing over the last few years, with a strong correlation to the sectors where offtake agreements are concentrated. Of course, not all FIDs are related to offtakes, as some projects are for self-consumption and don't involve signing an offtake agreement, but these projects are all for refining and industrial applications. This reinforces the idea that these sectors are readier for adoption in the near term. The implementation of demand policies is needed to unlock investment in hydrogen supply. Committed projects, thus that are operational, under construction, or that have reached FID, could produce more than 4 million tons of low emissions hydrogen by 2030. This level of committed supply is slightly lower than the demand that we estimate could be created by the policies that governments have fully implemented as of today. There is still a small gap, which is likely to be closed by 2030, with new FIDs that are expected to take place in the next 2-3 years. However, if we also consider those projects that are not yet committed but have strong potential to come online by 2030, potential production from these projects is well aligned with government targets for demand creation. This highlights the importance of unlocking investment in these projects to meet the government ambitions. But realizing this investment hinges itself on demand policy implementation. Despite initial efforts in places such as Europe, Japan, Korea, and India, the pace of implementation remains slow. This has occurred also at global level with the IMO Net Zero Framework, which is expected to promote uptake of low emissions fuels in maritime, but its final approval has been postponed until 2026. Moreover, policy efforts are being distributed across all sectors. Just above 50% of potential demand comes from existing uses in refining and industry, or the adoption of hydrogen-based fuels in applications like shipping or aviation, which, explained before, are readier for large-scale uptake in the short term. And now I will hand over to my colleague Amalia.
Thank you, and I would like now to go back to the project pipeline and to discuss a significant driver on a lot of these announcements. If we remember, the total project pipeline in this Global Hydrogen Review was of around 37 million tons of low emissions hydrogen by 2030. So 45% of this volume has a trade intention, and this is over 16 million tons of low emissions hydrogen by 2030 with a trade intention. When we look into the technological share in the total pipeline, around 25% of the projects were CCUS projects. However, for those intended to trade, the share of CCUS projects is lower, and this is because the CCUS projects have a lower intention to trade compared to electrolyzers, as it is a bit uncertain if some potential export markets will be able to accept them and qualify as low emissions hydrogen. But let's look a bit deeper. Only 1/4 of the trade-oriented projects have identified an off-taker, and the rest has not identified an off-taker, even if it is non-binding. Therefore, we wonder the certainty of the global market for hydrogen trade to realize by 2030 and how likely it is. Looking into the status of the different projects, around 5% of the trade projects, of these projects intended for trade, have achieved a final investment decision. That is around 1 million tons of low emissions hydrogen that will very likely be available for trade by 2030. And using the same likelihood analysis assessment that my colleague explained before, we identified that an additional 1 million tons of low emissions hydrogen by 2030 has a strong potential to be traded within this decade. But in order for this potential to realize and to have a final investment decision, we need not only to close the cost gap, not only to secure off-takers to foster the demand, but also an additional challenge for trade projects, that is to ensure that we develop the infrastructure that enables trade. And what we find is that around 75% of this volume from projects that have the intention for trade have a low potential, or they are uncertain that they will become operational by 2030. This share is relatively higher than in the global pipeline, where it was of 50%. As before, a lot of these projects a lot of this uncertainty comes from very large projects at the gigabyte size in emerging economies, and we will discuss later on some of the challenges that emerging economies face. So given the scale and the complexity of these projects, they have better prospects to be commissioned after 2030. So also trade is a major driving behind a lot of project announcements. Today, export-oriented projects have a much more challenging the situation to advance towards investment stage. But we also look a bit further into where these projects are announced towards where they are intending to export. So actually, well, most of the trade-oriented projects are actually announced in North America, the largest pipeline, but 60% of these trade-oriented projects are in emerging economies. So this is part of the challenge for these projects to be realized within this decade. And we see a lot of diversity of countries. We see an export that is quite well diversified compared to the export today of fossil fuels. When we look into the imports, that's very much concentrated with a very few importing countries in Northern Europe, namely Germany, the Netherlands, and then in the Asia-Pacific region, we see Korea and Japan. When looking into the carriers and how this low emissions hydrogen is expected to transport, there is something that catch our attention, is that 85% of this volume is intended to be traded as ammonia. 85% of this volume is 40 million tons of hydrogen, but when converted into ammonia, this is 75 million tons of ammonia that is expected to be traded from this project. But we need to put it into perspective, because today's ammonia production is 200 million tons, and today's global trade of ammonia is 20 million tons. So this means that these projects will need 4 times, or will transport 4 times more ammonia than what it is transported today. And that creates a challenge about infrastructure, because infrastructure is absolutely needed in order to be able to connect low-cost production where the demand is. We might have short-term transport distance. This might be covered by hydrogen transmission pipelines. This year, we count that we have around 37,000 kilometers of hydrogen pipelines that could potentially be operational by 2035, according to project announcements. However, only less than 6% of this transmission length has firm investment commitments. The progress has so far been focused in Northwestern Europe, in China, but there is a significant progress, and today the longest and largest hydrogen transmission pipelines are being built in the world. But we had this year a closer look into the role of ports, as energy trade by ship is central to the global economy and a cornerstone of energy security. And the role of ports is manifold. Ports enable the decarbonization of shipping, acting as bunkering hubs. Ports also enable aggregating demand, because today a lot of refineries of chemical sites that consume fossil-based hydrogen are located near ports. And third, what we discussed, ports enable the trade of low emissions hydrogen. So we first look at where announced low emissions hydrogen projects are located, as you can see in this map. But we also look into where today's main bunkering ports, and those ports with high traffic for containers, for dry bulk carriers, and for tankers are. So we look into the overlap between the main ports and where announced hydrogen projects are. So we actually identified that 70% of the volume from announced low emissions hydrogen project is located within 500 kilometers of a major port area. And actually around over 120 ports could each access at least 100,000 kilotons of low emissions hydrogen by 2030 from projects that are located somehow nearby. If we convert this low emissions hydrogen to methanol in energy terms, that will be equivalent to around 300,000 tons of fuel oil, which is around 10% the annual bunkering demand from ports like the Port of Shanghai, the Port of Algeciras, that are today between the top 20 bunkering ports today. However, the distribution is uneven, and what we find is that actually there is a higher concentration of potential more low emissions hydrogen available in those ports that handle dry bulk carriers, that handle tankers, and we see less, potentially less low emissions hydrogen close to container ports. And this is a challenge because what is carried in a container ship has usually a higher value than what is carried in the other types of ships, so it will be usually less sensitive to potential full price premiums associated with low emissions fuels. Nevertheless, there is progress. For example, most of the announced low emissions hydrogen projects are in inland China, away from the major container ports. However, there are announced interprovincial pipelines that will eventually bring low emissions hydrogen from inland to coastal cities. And very importantly, developing a port infrastructure for hydrogen-based fuels does not have to start from scratch. Existing facilities and experience handling other chemicals provide a strong foundation. So here you have an overview of different so-called terminals today for chemicals and for liquefied gases. We have in the world around 140 terminals for handling methanol that are either operational or under construction, 180 for ammonia, 300 for LNG liquefaction or regasification, but over 1,000 for LPG, for liquefied petroleum gases. This shows that ports already have extensive experience handling chemicals and liquefied gas, which is important as low emissions hydrogen fuels can be more complex to handle than conventional liquid fossil-based fuels today. And these ports are likely to be better positioned for the early adoption of low emissions fuels, as they have already in place not only the physical assets, the infrastructure, but also the permitting process and the training personnel. So to assess the readiness, the IEA developed a chemical handling infrastructure score that is inspired by similar initiatives that are being developed by the shipping industry. And this score considers the availability of all these plants. So nearly 80 ports, or nearly 80 ports that are these main ports, score high on this index. This means they have a stronger readiness to handle, to potentially handle low emissions hydrogen-based fuels in the short term. But we also identified that over 55 of these ports are located near significant high low emissions hydrogen projects, and even 35 of these are already main bunkering ports today. And when we look in this overlapping, where we have a high chemical handling infrastructure score and a high pipeline of low emissions hydrogen projects, we find this particularly in the Middle East, also around the Suez Canal, in the US East Coast, and in Europe. Nevertheless, over the medium to long term, additional ports can develop the necessary facilities, even if currently they have a lower score, as we have seen with the gradual rollout of LNG bunkering in recent years. And moving ahead with a topic that was very much discussed as one of the challenges why the uncertainty of some projects is quite high, is about emerging economies. and a role that low emissions hydrogen can play in emerging economies, not only to support the decarbonization of their economy, of their energy sector, but also to become competitive players in global energy trade. In this analysis, when we refer to emerging economies, we look into particularly Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Today, 35% of the world's population live there, but they consume only 16% of global energy demand. These regions each consume and produce similar levels of hydrogen, around 3 to 4 million tons per year, and combined, they account for roughly 11% of global hydrogen production. And what we see is that these regions have actually attracted a lot of attention from project developers, and together they represent almost 1/4 of the potential global production from announced projects for low emissions hydrogen. So if all these projects are realized, low emissions hydrogen could exceed 11 million tons by 2030, which is around today's fossil-based production there. These announced projects, however, represent notable difference compared to the global picture. So in the global pipeline, we had around 1/4 of low emissions projects being CCUS. However, in emerging economies, we found that almost the full majority is electrolytic projects. When we look into the status of these projects, they are at lower maturity states. At a global level, around 10% of the projects are operational of a final investment decision. In emerging economies, this cannot actually be seen in the figure, but it is 0.5%. So this raises question about the near-term viability, and also something that impacts the likelihood of the project is its size. So in emerging economies, actually 80% of announced projects are at the gigawatt scale, compared with about 60% globally. So this creates significant challenge in terms of the finance that must be mobilized and the new renewable power capacity that must be deployed within a short time frame. I'm also looking into the trade intention. Around 80% of announced projects in these regions are geared towards exports, so this is nearly double the global average. So this makes this project heavily dependent on an international hydrogen market that has yet to materialize at a scale as we have just seen. Therefore, for emerging economies to be able to unlock the economic potential that low emissions hydrogen offers them, a shift in strategic focus is needed to be able to bring these projects into fruition. And we highlight 4 different things that are particularly needed. We need first to build a strong foundation by expanding electricity access, particularly in Africa, 40% of the population lacks electricity access. We need to be able to integrate more renewables, strengthening the power grids, and while building local expertise. We need to address the issue of the very high cost of finance, which can be up to 3 times higher than in advanced economies. It is important that these regions also create domestic markets, particularly for fertilizers, which for most of the countries today, these are imported. And it's very important also that these regions prioritize value-added exports, such as hot briquetted iron, which is easier to ship, is a solid, and also has a higher value than just exporting raw materials. And with that, over to my colleague, Terry.
Thanks, Amanda. So I'll guide you through the 2 last items of the agenda, so policy and the special chapter in Southeast Asia. So for policy specifically, one key parameter to track is the public funding, just because of the importance of the cost gap, and then how much public funding is contributing to closing that gap. In the past year, around over $38 billion of public funding have made progress along the policy funnel from announcements to award. And to put this into context, the investment in hydrogen production in 2024 was $4.3 billion. So the public funding is nearly 10x of that amount. Some caveats related to this amount is that a lot of this funding is part of multi-year programs, so these are not annual flows. Another one is that this is a mix of CapEx and OpEx. And last one is that not all the public incentives can be translated into public funding. So for example, tax incentives, quotas, those cannot be easily translated to public funding. Almost 90% of the funding came from advanced economies. This also reflects the choice of instrument for the different economies. So, for example, in advanced ones, grants are much more common, while in emerging economies, policies like tax incentives, for example, are more common, which again cannot be easily translated to funding. And this also is not, it doesn't reflect the same split for the strategies. So if you look at hydrogen strategies, it has almost an even split. We track 65 strategies across the world, out of which 29 are from emerging economies. So the funding is different than that. In terms of where that money is going, for every dollar that goes to the demand side, $1.5 goes to the supply side. This is more balanced than the government targets. If we look at the government targets for 2030, the targets add up to 27 to 33 million tons on the supply side, while on the demand side, they add up to 10 million tons. So just to say, the funding is a bit more balanced than the targets. Then the next one would be on the demand side specifically. In terms of status, around 3/4 of the policies are enforced. And this is in comparison to just over a third in the last GHR edition. Some of the largest policies that are enforced are the hydrogen production tax incentives in Australia, a 20-year fixed premium in Denmark, and the European Hydrogen Bank. And what we see is basically maturation from the policy perspective, where before, again, we only had around a third of the policies in force, but many of those have now moved to actual awards, to actual tenders, and the money flowing to the specific projects. On the demand side, there were about $14 billion of public funding. This includes, for example, so some of the most prominent ones are the Carbon Contracts for Difference in Germany, where there were 500 projects in the first round, and the second round is ongoing. There are also innovation funds in Australia and the European Union, and hubs in India, Korea, and Spain. There was also significant progress in policies that are not related to funding. One notable example is a transposition to national legislation of the industry and transport targets of the Renewable Energy Directive in the European Union. Now, transitioning to Southeast Asia. This year, we took a closer look at the region with a special chapter. How Southeast Asia consumes about 4% of the global hydrogen demand. It has also abundant renewable resources, and it relies on imported hydrogen derivatives, which presents an opportunity. And it is also well positioned to develop a robust low emissions hydrogen industry. So in this slide, I will guide you through three items. One is a stock take of hydrogen, the strategies, and the trade. In the first one, in terms of where hydrogen stands, so as I said, it's 4 million tons in 2024, the hydrogen demand. 85% of this demand was concentrated in 4 countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Singapore. This also reflects the the size of their economies and the population. Nearly half of the demand was for ammonia production, 31% for refining, and 20% for methanol production. That's on the demand side. On the supply, 80% of the production was from natural gas, unabated natural gas, and the other 20% from industrial byproduct. And the natural gas consumption used for hydrogen represented about 8% of the gas supply in 2024, so significant. Even more significant considering that the region is a net exporter of gas today, but is expected to transition to being a net importer in the coming 1 or 2 years. In terms of a strategy, there are 5 countries that Malaysia, Vietnam, and Laos, and there's a diversity in their approach and coverage. So, for example, in terms of production, Indonesia and Laos are mostly targeting renewable hydrogen, while Malaysia and Vietnam target a more balanced mix with renewable hydrogen and fossil fuels with CCUS. There's also a mix in terms of trade. So, for example, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam are targeting exports, while Singapore is aiming to import. There's also diversity in terms of uses. For example, Indonesia and Singapore have power as one of the main uses, while industry is the main targeted application in Malaysia. What they all have in common is the ambition. All of them have ambitious growth to 2050, 2060 for the future years compared to the current demand. And another commonality is that none of them has a certification scheme in place, which would be key for the trade for the international trade, but work is ongoing in 3 of the countries. And the last aspect here is in terms of trade. At the regional level, Southeast Asia is a net ammonia exporter, but as you will see later, that snapshot is different by country. It has a nearly balanced production and demand of methanol, and it's a large importer of crude steel. Now, in the next one, in terms of opportunities, there are basically 4 opportunities for the region. One is the renewable hydrogen potential. Second one is displacement of imports of hydrogen derivatives. Third is the high demand concentration for these assets. And fourth is a deployment through state-owned enterprises. I will show you some figures for the first 2, the renewable potential and imports, and I will briefly touch upon the other 2. So in terms of renewable potential, most of the potential is in the form of solar PV. Southeast Asian countries could have nearly 11 million tons of hydrogen potential at a production cost below $6 per kilogram by 2030. This doesn't mean that they will be able to produce this amount by 2030, but it represents an upper bound. The timeline is just defined to be able to have a cost and be able to assess the levelized cost of production. Indonesia would reach almost 60% of this potential, followed by Cambodia and Thailand with 13% and 10% respectively. The supply cost curves, as you can see here, are relatively flat, so you can unlock new potential based on a relatively small premium for the production cost. More than 90% of the renewable hydrogen that can be produced below $5.5 per kilogram of hydrogen is in Indonesia, concentrated specifically in Java, Kalimantan, Sumatra, and Sulawesi. An additional cost premium of $0.5 per kilogram would allow these countries to produce, specifically Cambodia, Myanmar, and Philippines. So an additional premium of 0.5 would unlock the renewable potential in these countries. Some of this potential has also made it to the project pipeline, which has 25 projects adding up to 480 kilotons per annum. So this is roughly 12% of the current hydrogen demand. And all the capacity in the pipeline is renewable hydrogen, and the capacity in the pipeline also reflects roughly the potential that we see here. So a lot of it is concentrated, 90% is in Indonesia and Malaysia. The pipeline still needs to go through a maturation process, with only 6% of the pipeline having taken FID, which is lower than the 12% that we see at the global level. The other aspect, the second opportunity, is around import of hydrogen derivatives, so displacing those. As I mentioned, for example, in ammonia, the region is a net exporter of ammonia, but you see basically that all the countries except for Indonesia and Malaysia are large importers. So then renewable hydrogen derivatives would provide an opportunity to increase domestic production and therefore energy security. The other opportunities around concentration of the demand. A lot of this production is in a few plants. So for example, Indonesia produced nearly 2/3 of the regional output across just 5 plants. Similarly, Malaysia represented nearly 70% of the regional output across 4 plants, and 70% of the regional steel production is in Indonesia and Vietnam. So if these 2 countries transition, then it would make a big difference for the regional balance. Similarly, for methanol, for example, 2 plants in Malaysia, representing more than half of the regional capacity, are more than 25 years old. So this presents an opportunity to consider renewable routes to replace that capacity. For steel, the importing countries are mostly reliant on scrap-based electric arc furnaces. So iron produced with hydrogen would not displace these technologies, but instead could provide the iron that could be used along scrap in these furnaces and reduce the reliance on scrap or finished steel, and allowing these countries to move up the value chain in iron production. And the last opportunity I mentioned was on state-owned enterprises. So one example is in Malaysia. Petronas owns most of the existing hydrogen production capacity and considers hydrogen as one of the pillars of their transition strategy. Petronas has already a production target of 1.2 million tons per annum by 2030 and is exploring exports by pipeline to Singapore. It also has a proprietary electrolyzer technology and is involved in several hydrogen projects, including outside Malaysia. And another quick example is in Indonesia, Pertamina, the state-owned enterprise. is aiming to produce 1 million tons of low emissions hydrogen by 2030, ramping up to 3 million tons per annum by 2060. It already has 17 projects under evaluation with a cumulative capacity of 1.8 million tons by 2040. And another example is PTPLN, the domestic electric utility, which has already executed pilots for renewable hydrogen production and use for road transport. Then the other side of the coin are the challenges. And this resembles closely to what Amalia mentioned earlier in slide 13 around Andes. The challenges for Southeast Asia, we'll touch upon three. So one is the cost of capital. Second is the low renewable penetration, specifically for wind and solar. And third is the lack of policies to shift the current hydrogen use to low emissions in the industrial applications. So in the first one, the cost of capital, Southeast Asia had today at least twice the cost of capital of advanced economies in China. And this can translate into a significant cost premium, as we see in the slide in the red bars. This widens the gap with natural gas with CCUS. We also have to remember that this is a snapshot for today. So two aspects that are not captured in this representation is one is energy security. So any domestic renewable hydrogen production will contribute to higher energy security. And the other is price volatility. Gas is exposed to fluctuations in the price. Whereas with renewable hydrogen, you can secure a PPA on the supply side, you can secure an offtake agreement on the demand side, and have a more stable price for the entire period. A lower cost of capital through risk mitigation measures is also needed, and then that would erode part of the differential that we saw before. And as Amalia mentioned before, this can be achieved through, for example, offtake certainty through public procurement for domestic supply, a clear regulation, streamlined permitting, or investment enabling infrastructure. Development finance institutions also have a role and could expand concessional loans, guarantees, and first loss facilities to improve bankability and mobilize private capital through blended finance. The second challenge is around the relatively small share of variable renewables in the electricity mix. As you see there, hydropower has a high penetration in the different countries, but only Vietnam has a combined wind and solar PV share higher than 10%. The reason why this is a challenge is because it means that the domestic industry is not developed yet in some countries, making the step for renewable hydrogen larger. So the renewable industry would need to be developed and the hydrogen industry as well. This would also be any electricity that is used for renewable hydrogen would also be displacing a more effective direct use of electricity, which is essential to reduce emissions, given the prominent role of coal in the generation mix. And lastly, the last challenge is that more could be done in terms of promoting the shift of existing industrial applications to low emissions hydrogen and incentivize the emergence of new hydrogen applications. Carbon pricing in the countries that have it in place is not enough to close the cost gap, and there are no clear demand signals to enhance offtake certainty. Indonesia, Malaysia, and Laos specify actions to promote the uptake of low emissions hydrogen strategies, and these are expected to translate into specific legislation in the coming years. And with this, I'll pass the floor to Jose, who will guide you through the policy recommendations.
Thank you, Geri. So now to finish, just a brief explanation of the policy recommendations that we have outlined in the report. First of all, it is important to maintain support schemes for low emissions hydrogen production. Many projects are ready to invest in if timely support helps them to close the cost gap with unabated fossil-based hydrogen, enabling rapid scale-up and cost reduction. Second, there is a need to accelerate demand creation, so it can facilitate offtake and underpin investments. Key opportunities in the near term are in existing hydrogen uses, such as refineries and chemicals, and also in pulling demand in industrial hubs, which can create the scale and help reducing risks. We also think that governments and industry can also cooperate in the creation of lead markets for sustainable end-use products, which can unlock early-stage adoption. There is a need to expedite the deployment of hydrogen infrastructure. Infrastructure projects often take more time than originally planned, so clear regulations, financial tools, and efficient permitting can cut early investment risks and avoid further delays. We also think that it will be positive to provide support to early-stage hydrogen technologies with public finance instruments that can help to reduce risks. For example, export credit agencies and public finance institutions can provide warranties for first-of-a-kind projects that seek to demonstrate and scale up novel technologies. And finally, we also think that it's important to support emerging and developing economies in moving up in the value chain. These countries have great potential for low-cost and low-emissions hydrogen production, but face challenges such as access to finance and limited infrastructure. By partnering with advanced economies, they can develop domestic use cases and open export opportunities to hydrogen-based products. And then to finalize, as Timur mentioned at the beginning, I would like to introduce you to a new online tool that we have launched this year along the report and our regular project databases. This tool that we have called the IEA's Hydrogen Tracker is a new data source in which you could access much more information and much more detail than the one that we can present in the report in the PDF. It includes a map of operational and announced projects for low emissions hydrogen production with information about their location, their size, their technology, and status. It also includes data on production of low emissions hydrogen and infrastructure, both historical and the potential for announced projects, not only at global level, but also with a breakdown by region and by country. It contains detailed analysis on today's production cost and potential cost reductions by 2030 in different regions of the world. And finally, a policy dashboard with more than 1,000 hydrogen policy measures worldwide that have been announced or implemented since 2020, since the first Global Hydrogen Review. They are classified by country, type of policies, status, and with the possibility of accessing a description detailed for each of the policies. So we invite you to explore the tool, to play a bit with it, since we think that you will find it very useful. We are running a bit out of time, but we are going to try to address some of the questions that you have put in the Q&A. So some of them we have already addressed them in written, but we will try to address quickly 3 of the questions. The first one was about the outlook for synthetic hydrocarbons. So what we have seen is that this is going to be strongly dependent on policy implementation. We have seen some positive developments in Europe, for example, in the case of aviation, with some offtakes from projects, but we are still seeing some barriers that need to be addressed beyond the cost, which remains very high. But things like the need of securing long-term offtake agreements when actually aviation companies work with in spot markets. So this difference of operation between the two, the supply and the demand side, will need to be addressed. But again, we see some positive developments, particularly in the Europe and in China. They will still remain as a low part of the demand side of low emissions hydrogen, but we expect some positive news in the coming years. Another one was about policy developments in China, policy initiatives, and where we expect some acceleration. I think Herb, you were going to.
Yeah, briefly on that, I would divide it in 3. So plan, drivers, and numbers. In the plan, I think one indication is the peak of emissions and the reduction of 7–10% that China has announced on NDC. Indicates that China cannot achieve that target only with the decarbonization of power. So it might be a driver for more hydrogen production to be able to achieve the CO2 reduction target. That's one. 2 key numbers is that capacity that has FID in China in terms of electrolysis, 2.8 gigawatts. That's significant considering the current, in 2024, the global capacity was just 2 gigawatts. So 2.8 with FID, and also orders. The orders from January to June were 3.8 gigawatts. Not all of that might materialize in terms of actual projects, but it's also, again, a huge number. And the last one, which also might be the one that the question was alluding to, that China recently announced, 20% capex subsidy for hydrogen, including green methanol and SAF production as well. Which is kind of the first sign at the central level of support and subsidies for hydrogen. And then that's a significant milestone that could be complemented with support at this province level. So positive outlook for China.
Thank you, Arif. And there was another one on trade flows and the intention for the hydrogen derivative carrier to be converted back into hydrogen or used directly, and where we have any breakdown of the projects between carrier and direct use. So, Amalia, you can help.
Yeah, so we are not able to actually track the final end use of this ammonia, because even if it reached an import destination, it might be used in different ways. But we are able to track is about the status of ammonia cracking projects. That is also published in the infrastructure chapter of the Global Hydrogen Review. We are also able to track the technological readiness levels of ammonia cracking. The technology is still not commercially available. So this year, what we saw is the largest plant that became operational in the port of Antwerp in Belgium. There are also further plans to expand it from Air Liquide. There is other project of ammonia cracking under construction in Germany, and also more projects for constructions of ammonia cracking related to the power sector in Korea. But yet the technological readiness level of ammonia becomes a bit uncertain. We know that some ports are in their market surveys, in their call for interest, are trying to gauge the interest for ammonia cracking, but still that remains very uncertain.
Thank you very much, Amalia. And with that, we are already out of time. So we will try to find a way to respond some of the questions, maybe in written. We, of course, remain at your disposal if you want to reach out to the team to ask any further questions. And we would like to thank you for your attention and wish you a nice rest of the day. Thank you very much.